The crystal goblets caught the candlelight like captured fireflies, wine swirling crimson as 12 members of the Whitmore family raised their glasses for grace. Within minutes, they would all be dying. This is the story of how one enslaved woman brought an entire Mississippi plantation to its knees with nothing more than patience, arsenic, and a ladle. Clara stood in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room, her hands folded neatly over her apron, watching the Whitmore family settle into their evening meal on that humid August night in 1847. The grandfather clock in the parlor chimed 7 times, each note hanging in the thick Mississippi air like a funeral bell. The smell of roasted duck mingled with magnolia blossoms drifting through open windows, while beneath it all lurked something else, the faint metallic tang of arsenic that no one at the table could yet detect. The Whitmore plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of cotton fields outside Natchez, where the Mississippi River curved like a serpent's spine. Judge Cornelius Whitmore presided over the estate with the same iron grip he used in the courtroom, his wife Margaret managing the household of 47 enslaved people with what she called Christian firmness. Their 4 adult children had returned home for the judge's 62nd birthday celebration, bringing spouses and grandchildren, filling the great house with laughter that would soon turn to screams. Clara had been purchased at auction in New Orleans 11 years earlier. Separated from her 2 young daughters who were sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, she never saw them again. In the Whitmore kitchen, she became invisible, a pair of hands that stirred pots, kneaded bread, and seasoned meals with the expertise that made the judge boast to his colleagues about having the finest table in Adams County. The arsenic had been surprisingly easy to acquire. Sold as rat poison at the general store, a Negro woman purchasing it raised no suspicion. The big house always had rats. Clara had been collecting it for 3 months, storing small amounts in a hollow gourd hidden behind the flour sacks. She knew exactly how much to use, enough to kill, but not so much that the bitter taste would warn them with the first bite. The youngest grandchild, 6-year-old Emma, pushed her vegetables around her plate. "These taste funny, grandmother?" "Nonsense," Margaret replied without looking up from her plate. "Clean your plate. Clara's cooking is above reproach." The horrible poetry of it. Clara had mixed the poison into the wine reduction she'd spooned over the duck, stirred it into the cream sauce on the vegetables, even dusted it like sugar over the birthday cake waiting in the kitchen. Every dish that would touch their lips carried death in its seasoning. The family continued their meal, discussing cotton prices and upcoming social engagements, while their fate crystallized in their bloodstreams with each swallow. Judge Whitmore raised his glass for a toast, his third of the evening. "To family," he declared, his voice already beginning to slur, though he attributed it to the wine. "To prosperity. To the natural order of things." Clara's fingers tightened on the doorframe. By 7:45, young Emma had vomited onto the tablecloth. Her mother rushed to her side but found her own legs buckling. The judge tried to stand, his face flushing purple, hands clutching his throat. One by one, like dominoes in a grotesque game, the Whitmore family began to convulse. "The food!" someone gasped. "We've been poisoned!" All eyes turned to the kitchen doorway. But Clara had already disappeared. The dining room erupted into chaos, chairs overturning, bodies hitting the floor. The youngest Whitmore son crawled toward the door, only to collapse inches from escape. Margaret Whitmore, even as foam gathered at the corners of her mouth, had enough strength left to scream one word that echoed through the plantation quarters. "Clara!" But here's what the historical record doesn't capture: the other enslaved people in the house that night. The footman who could have run for the doctor but walked slowly instead. The housemaids who heard the screams but finished folding laundry before investigating. The stable boy who saw Clara heading toward the river with a bundle but told no one until morning. What would you have done, standing in that doorway watching your captors suffer? Would you have helped? Or would you have disappeared into the night like smoke? 12 people sat down to supper at the Whitmore plantation, on August 18, 1847. By morning, the big house would be silent as a tomb, and Clara would be 20 miles downriver, following the Underground Railroad's invisible map toward a freedom she'd purchased with arsenic and rage. But the story doesn't end with empty chairs and cold soup. By 8:15, the Whitmore dining room looked like a battlefield where the enemy was invisible, and victory meant simply drawing another breath. The judge had collapsed face first into his birthday cake. The true horror of arsenic poisoning isn't the death. It's the waiting. Inside the great house, 12 members of the Whitmore family writhed in various stages of agony, their symptoms cascading like a symphony written in suffering. The grandfather clock continued its steady count, each tick marking another second of their descent. The scent of magnolia had been replaced by the acrid smell of vomit and fear, while the polished oak floors grew slick with perspiration and worse. Through the tall windows, the quarters cabins glowed with lamplight, but no help came running. Dr. Edmund Hayes lived only 3 miles away, treating plantation families across Adams County with a combination of modern medicine and old Mississippi pragmatism. That night, his medical bag would remain closed, his horse unsaddled. The messenger who should have fetched him, a young enslaved man named Thomas, stood frozen in the main hallway, watching Judge Whitmore crawl across Persian rugs that had cost more than Thomas would earn in 10 lifetimes. Margaret Whitmore, despite the fire spreading through her organs, managed to drag herself to the silver bell used to summon servants. She rang it frantically, the clear notes cutting through the chaos like a scream. In the kitchen, 6 enslaved workers heard it perfectly. They looked at each other, an entire conversation passing in glances, then returned to washing dishes as if nothing had happened. The youngest grandchild, Emma, died first, her small body unable to fight the poison coursing through her veins. Her mother, Rachel Whitmore, held her daughter's corpse and wailed with a grief that transcended her own agony. "Why?" she screamed to the heavens, to the servants, to anyone who would listen. She was innocent. But innocence, as Clara knew, had never protected enslaved children from being sold, beaten, or worked to death. Judge Whitmore's son, James, a lawyer from Jackson who'd inherited his father's cruelty along with his sharp jawline, tried to take charge even as his legs failed him. "Block the roads," he gasped to no one in particular. "Find that woman. There will be hell to pay." The field hands heard the commotion from their quarters, sounds of retching, screaming, furniture crashing. Some pulled their thin doors shut and hugged their children close. Others sat on their porches, silent witnesses to a justice they'd never dared imagine. Old Moses, who'd lost 3 fingers to the judge's temper, actually smiled. Meanwhile, Clara was making her way through the swamp paths she'd memorized during 11 years of bondage. Every full moon she'd studied these routes while gathering herbs for the kitchen, planning for a night exactly like this. In her bundle, a change of clothes, $37 stolen from Margaret's drawer over the years, and forged papers identifying her as a free woman named Sarah Coleman. Back in the dining room, the judge experienced a moment of terrible clarity between convulsions, his eyes bloodshot and wild fixed on the portrait of his father hanging above the mantelpiece, another plantation owner who died suddenly at dinner 20 years before. A cold realization washed over him. Had that been murder, too? How many meals had been seasoned with revenge? "The children?" Margaret wheezed, reaching for her adult sons even as her vision blurred. "Save the children?" But there would be no saving, no heroic rides for help, no last-minute remedies. The arsenic worked methodically, shutting down organs in a precise sequence Clara had researched by listening to Dr. Hayes during his visits, pretending to dust while memorizing every word about dosages and symptoms. She had tested small amounts on the plantation dogs first, noting how long it took, adjusting her calculations. This wasn't impulse, it was engineering. By 9, half the family had lost consciousness. The conscious ones could only watch their loved ones fade, knowing their turn was coming. James Whitmore used his final minutes to scrawl something on a napkin with a shaking hand. Clara did this. As if anyone would need the confirmation. But here's what changes everything. In the quarters, Clara's close friend Ruth was telling others that Clara had been planning to poison only the judge. The birthday dinner with the entire family present hadn't been part of the plan. Something had changed that very morning, something that made Clara decide that one death wasn't enough. The house grew quieter as voices failed, replaced by labored breathing and occasional moans. The candles burned lower, casting dancing shadows that made the dying seem to move even when they'd gone still. A mockingbird outside began its nighttime repertoire, cycling through stolen songs, while inside a different kind of theft was completing itself, lives for lives, a family for a family. By 10:00, only Margaret still clung to consciousness, her fingers wrapped around her husband's cold hand. In her delirium, she whispered apologies, not to God, but to someone named Bessie. The housemaid listening from the hallway knew that name, an enslaved woman who died in childbirth after the judge refused to call a doctor, saying she wasn't worth the expense. The last sound Margaret Whitmore heard before the darkness claimed her wasn't prayer or comfort, but the creak of footsteps as the household staff finally entered the room, not to help, but to witness. They stood in a semicircle, silent as ghosts, watching their owner's final moments with expressions that held neither satisfaction nor pity, just stone-cold memory. At 11:47 p.m., 12 members of the Whitmore family lay dead in their finery, the birthday cake still decorated with unlit candles. The great house fell into a silence so complete that you could hear the Spanish moss whispering against the windows. And somewhere in the dark between Mississippi and Freedom, Clara stopped to wash the flour from beneath her fingernails, in a creek that would carry away the last evidence of her kitchen life. But the enslaved people she left behind would face questions, investigations, and consequences that would ripple through Adams County like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Dawn broke over the Whitmore plantation like a held breath finally released. Sunlight streamed through windows to illuminate 12 corpses arranged around a dining table like a macabre still life. The birthday candles had melted into waxy puddles. What happens to a plantation when every white person on the property dies in a single night? The roosters crowed at 5:30 a.m. as they always did, indifferent to the carnage in the big house. The morning air carried the smell of honeysuckle and death in equal measure, while dewdrops gathered on spider webs stretched between porch railings like nature's crime scene tape. In the quarters, 47 enslaved people faced a terrible decision: report the deaths and face interrogation, or seize this unprecedented moment of freedom. Ruth, Clara's closest friend, was the first to act. She'd been the Whitmores' head housemaid for 15 years, trusted with keys to every room except the judge's study. Now she stood in that forbidden sanctuary, rifling through papers with trembling hands. Land deeds, bills of sale, contracts including her own, listing her value at $800 like she was livestock with a good pedigree. "Burn it all," suggested Samuel the blacksmith, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell them bandits came in the night." But old Moses, his three-fingered hand resting on his cane, shook his gray head. "You think they'll believe bandits poisoned a family at dinner? They'll hang every last one of us before asking questions." The debate raged in hushed tones, while upstairs, flies had already discovered the feast. By 7 a.m., a field hand named Jupiter had been chosen to ride to the neighboring Turner plantation with news of a terrible sickness at the Whitmore house, the story they'd agreed upon. The family had taken ill during dinner, and despite the servants' best efforts to help, all had succumbed to what appeared to be tainted food. No mention of Clara, who, as far as anyone knew, had been sold to a plantation in Georgia 2 weeks prior. That bill of sale was Ruth's masterwork, forged with ink mixed fresh that morning, aged with coffee grounds and smoke, bearing a signature she'd practiced copying 100 times. Clara had taught her to read and write in secret by candlelight, risking the lash for each letter learned. When Sheriff William Donovan arrived at 9:43 a.m. with the county coroner, he found a scene of orchestrated chaos. Servants wept convincingly over their dead owners, while others scrubbed at stains that would never come clean. Ruth met them at the door, her eyes red-rimmed from rubbing them with onion juice. "It happened so fast, Sheriff," she sobbed. "One moment they were celebrating, the next—" She gestured helplessly toward the dining room. The coroner, Dr. Marcus Webb, was a meticulous man who'd studied in Philadelphia before returning south. He examined each body with scientific precision, noting the cherry-red flush of skin, the contracted pupils, the foam dried at mouth corners. His preliminary assessment: arsenic poisoning, without question. The amount suggested in his notes would have required access to pounds of the substance. "Who prepared the meal?" Sheriff Donovan asked, though he already suspected the answer. "We all did," Ruth replied, a half-truth wrapped in loyalty. "Clara made the sauces before she left, but I finished the cooking. Samuel carved the duck. Letty prepared the vegetables. If the food was tainted, we all touched it." Brilliant. Spread the blame so thin it became transparent. The sheriff examined the kitchen, finding it spotless. The enslaved workers had spent all night cleaning, removing any trace of the poison preparation. The pantry showed only ordinary ingredients. The rat poison tucked behind flour sacks contained exactly the amount listed on its purchase receipt from 6 months prior. But Dr. Webb noticed something the others missed: a single magnolia petal on the kitchen floor, carried in on someone's shoe. Magnolia trees didn't grow near the kitchen, only by the river path. Someone had been outside during the night, walking where they shouldn't have been. "Search the grounds," the sheriff ordered. "Every cabin, every outbuilding." The search revealed nothing but the expected poverty of slave quarters: corn husk mattresses, mended clothes, a few hidden coins. What they didn't find was more telling. No letters, no books, no sign of the secret school Clara had been running for 3 years, teaching others to read by copying Bible verses. Those materials had been burned at 3 a.m., the ashes scattered in the vegetable garden. By noon, word had spread to every plantation in Adams County. White families locked their doors and eyed their servants with fresh suspicion. Some dismissed their cooks entirely, choosing hunger over fear. The Turner family made their enslaved workers taste every dish before serving, turning meals into poison-testing rituals. Meanwhile, Clara was riding a lumber wagon driven by a free black man named Josiah, part of the Underground Railroad network that operated like whispered prayers through the Deep South. She'd made it to the Louisiana border, her forged papers holding up under cursory inspection. The wagon carried hidden compartments with 3 other runaways, but Clara rode openly, playing the part of Sarah Coleman, seamstress heading to visit family in Baton Rouge. Back at the Whitmore plantation, the investigation intensified. A judge from Jackson arrived to oversee the legal complexities. With no white heirs present and all direct family dead, the estate's ownership fell into question. The 47 enslaved people existed in a terrifying limbo, technically still property, but of whom? Sheriff Donovan questioned each worker separately, looking for cracks in their story, but they held firm to the narrative Ruth had crafted. Clara had been sold. The family had eaten normally. The sickness came suddenly. When pressed about Clara's whereabouts in Georgia, Ruth produced letters forged over the previous 2 weeks in anticipation of this moment. "She writes that the Belmont family treats her well," Ruth said, eyes downcast. "Says she misses her friends here, but accepts God's will. God's will wrapped in arsenic." Dr. Webb performed autopsies that afternoon, confirming massive arsenic poisoning in every victim. The amount suggested deliberate murder, not accidental contamination. But with the supposed perpetrator sold to Georgia and no witnesses willing to break ranks, the investigation stalled. That evening, as the Whitmore bodies were prepared for burial, the enslaved community gathered in their quarters for prayer. But between the hymns and amens, they exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They'd survived the first day of questioning. Now came the harder test, maintaining their story as the investigation widened, as rewards were offered, as pressure mounted to give up Clara. Old Moses led the prayer, his three-fingered hand raised to heaven. Lord, we pray for the souls of the departed. May they find the peace in death they denied others in life. Amen, the gathering responded, their voices carrying across cotton fields where they'd return to work tomorrow. The plantation running on momentum and muscle memory while lawyers sorted out who would own them next. But first, they had to survive the next wave of investigation. Because Sheriff Donovan had just received word that no Belmont plantation existed in Georgia, where Clara had supposedly been sold. Sheriff Donovan's boots struck the Whitmore kitchen floor like a judge's gavel as he waved the telegram from Georgia. There is no Belmont plantation. Never has been. You've all been lying to me. The morning sun cast prison bar shadows through the kitchen windows, where 6 enslaved workers stood in a line, their fabricated story crumbling like old parchment. Ruth kept her expression neutral, despite her racing heartbeat. She'd learned long ago that survival meant becoming a mirror, reflecting back whatever white folks wanted to see. The telegram fluttering in Donovan's hand might as well have been a noose. Behind her, she could hear Samuel's labored breathing, feel Letty's trembling, sense the fear rolling off them in waves thick as Mississippi humidity. Now, Donovan continued, his voice dropping to a whisper more terrifying than any shout, let's discuss what really happened to Clara. 20 miles away, Clara, now Sarah Coleman, sat in the colored section of a steamboat heading up the Mississippi River. The ticket collector had barely glanced at her papers, distracted by a white woman complaining about her cabin. Clara kept her head down, fingers wrapped around a rosary she'd never used before, playing the part of a devout freed woman heading to Memphis for church work. Back in the kitchen, Ruth made a calculated decision. Clara had been acting strange since her daughters were sold, she began, allowing tears to well up. Real ones, remembering those girls. She said she had a cousin in Georgia who could get her work. We helped her leave because we were afraid of what she might do. When Donovan pressed, she added, just like we said 2 weeks ago. The sheriff studied each face, looking for the telltale signs of deception. But these were people who'd spent their entire lives hiding thoughts, swallowing words, surviving by becoming invisible. They gave him nothing. Meanwhile, the legal vultures had descended on the Whitmore estate. Distant cousins emerged from 3 states away, claiming inheritance rights. Lawyers arrived in carriages, calculating the value of land, cotton, and human property with equal dispassion. The 47 enslaved people found themselves being appraised like furniture while their fate hung in bureaucratic limbo. That afternoon, Donovan ordered something unprecedented, a massive manhunt. He dispatched riders to every major road, river crossing, and railway station within 100 miles. Clara's description, Negro woman approximately 30 years, 5'4", small scar on left hand from kitchen burn, was posted in every town square from Natchez to New Orleans. But Clara had anticipated this. Before leaving, she'd used lye to lighten her skin just enough to confuse descriptions, styled her hair differently, and patted her clothes to appear heavier. The scar on her hand was hidden under gloves she'd stolen from Margaret Whitmore's drawer. Fine kid leather that marked her as a woman of means rather than a runaway cook. The hunt intensified when investigators found something hidden in Clara's abandoned cabin, a journal written in a crude code. Dr. Webb spent hours deciphering it, finally breaking through to reveal recipes but not for food. Page after page detailed poison preparations, dosage calculations, and most chillingly, a list of names with dates beside them. "My God," Webb whispered. The Whitmore family wasn't her first. 3 other names appeared above the Whitmores, all prominent plantation families who'd suffered mysterious deaths over the past 5 years. The Hendersons in 1843, patriarch died of stomach ailment. The Beauregards in 1845, 2 sons dead from tainted whiskey. The Lancasters in 1846, matriarch and daughter succumbed to summer fever. Clara had been sold between each household. Now her method became clear. She would work quietly, earn trust, and when the moment came, strike with precision before being sold to the next unsuspecting family. The Whitmores had simply been her magnum opus, her final statement before disappearing. Bodies were exhumed, tests were conducted. Arsenic found in all of them. The realization sent shockwaves through Mississippi society. How many other cooks were planning similar revenge? How many faithful servants were actually biding their time? Paranoia spread faster than yellow fever. Plantation kitchens were locked at night. Food tasters were employed. Some families dismissed their entire household staffs, preferring to cook for themselves rather than risk poisoning. On the river, Clara listened to white passengers discuss the murders with horrified fascination. A woman in silk complained that she could no longer trust her cook of 20 years. A merchant suggested that all household slaves should be chained at night. A minister proclaimed it proof that the African race was incapable of Christian mercy. Clara fingered the vial of poison still hidden in her bodice, one final dose in case of capture. She'd rather die free than live enslaved. By the 4th day, the manhunt had expanded across state lines. The reward increased to $2,000. Professional slave catchers joined the search, men who could track a runaway across water and stone. They brought dogs trained on clothing from Clara's cabin, though Ruth had thoughtfully contaminated the scent with pepper and turpentine. But the real brilliance of Clara's escape lay not in misdirection, but in network. The Underground Railroad had been preparing for this moment for months. At each stop, she was passed between conductors who asked no questions, offered no judgment, a minister in Baton Rouge, a shopkeeper in Memphis, a farmer outside Nashville, each risking their lives for a woman they'd never met, bound by the simple belief that freedom was worth any danger. One close call came at the Tennessee border. A slave catcher named Briggs had tracked her to a safe house, arriving just hours after she'd left. He found the building empty except for an elderly free black woman named Aunt Cora, who claimed to know nothing about any runaways. "You're lying," Briggs snarled, but Cora just smiled. "Sir, I'm 73 years old. What would I want with harboring fugitives? I can barely harbor my own bones." He left empty-handed, not noticing the fresh wheel tracks leading north, or the way Cora's hands shook after he'd gone. Back at the Whitmore plantation, pressure was mounting on the enslaved community. The new overseer, brought in by the estate lawyers, was a cruel man named Patterson who believed in breaking spirits to find truth. He started with the youngest, questioning children about what they'd seen, who Clara had talked to, where she might run. But the children had been well taught. They knew nothing, saw nothing. Clara had barely spoken to anyone, they claimed. She kept to herself. Strange woman, always muttering about her lost daughters. One boy, barely 8, looked Patterson straight in the eye and said, "She told me once that poison was sweeter than sugar if you knew how to serve it right." Everyone held their breath, but Patterson just laughed. Children and their wild stories. The boy had been fed that line by Ruth, calculated to be just strange enough to be dismissed. Meanwhile, 3 states away, Clara reached a station in Ohio where she could finally rest. The safe house was run by Quakers who asked only her first name. Not Clara, not Sarah, but the name she'd been born with before slavery stole it. Adoni. It meant beloved in Yoruba, her mother's language. Adoni, she whispered to herself in the darkness, tasting freedom on her tongue for the first time in 30 years. But freedom was still fragile, and the hunt was far from over. Because back in Mississippi, Sheriff Donovan had just made a connection that would change everything. A pattern in Clara's movements that might predict where she was heading. Sheriff Donovan spread 4 maps across the courthouse table, each marked with red X's where Clara had killed. A line connected them, heading steadily northeast. She's not running random. She's heading somewhere specific. The revelation came at 2:30 a.m. after hours of connecting deaths, dates, and destinations. The lamplight flickered across the maps, casting shadows that danced like guilty secrets, while tobacco smoke hung thick enough to cut. Outside, September rain hammered the courthouse roof with the intensity of drummed accusations. In the corner, Dr. Webb traced the route with his finger, his medical mind seeing what others had missed. "Look at the names," Webb said quietly. "Henderson sold slaves to Bogard. Bogard's daughter married a Lancaster, and Margaret Whitmore." He pulled out a yellowed ledger. Her maiden name was Henderson. The room fell silent, except for the rain's percussion. Clara hadn't been randomly assigned to these households. She'd been tracking a specific network of families. But why these particular ones? What connected them beyond marriage and money? The answer lay in a water-stained bill of sale from 1836 discovered in Judge Whitmore's personal effects, a transaction for 1 Negro woman aged 19 called Clara and 2 female children ages 3 and 5. The seller, Henderson Plantation. The buyers, various parties at the New Orleans slave market. "Dear God," Donovan whispered, "she's been hunting the families who sold her daughters." 100 miles north, Clara, still traveling as Sarah Coleman, sat in a small AME church outside Cincinnati, listening to a sermon about Moses leading his people from bondage. The congregation swayed with the rhythm of shared understanding, voices rising in harmonies that spoke of sorrows too deep for words alone. She clutched her rosary, the one prop in her performance she'd grown genuinely attached to. After service, the minister's wife, Mrs. Elizabeth Harper, approached her. "Sister Sarah, you seem troubled." Clara had learned to calibrate her lies with enough truth to make them breathable. "I'm searching for my daughters. They were separated from me years ago. I heard they might have gone north." Mrs. Harper's face softened with a particular understanding of a community where every family had separation stories. What were their names? Patience and Grace. The names tasted like prayers and poison in equal measure. "They'd be 18 and 20 now. I was told they were sold to a family heading to Canada." What Clara didn't reveal was that she'd traced her daughters through years of careful questioning, bribing other slaves for information, following trails of paperwork with the dedication of a bloodhound. The Lancaster family had purchased Grace. The Beauregards had taken Patience. Both girls had been resold within a year, but Clara had made their first purchasers pay anyway. Back in Mississippi, the investigation had taken on the urgency of a holy crusade. Plantation owners across 3 states demanded action. The governor himself issued a statement calling Clara a threat to the very foundation of civilized society. The reward jumped to $5,000, more than most men would see in a lifetime. Patterson, the new overseer at Whitmore Plantation, had instituted a reign of calculated terror. Every enslaved person was questioned daily. Meals were withheld from those whose stories wavered. Children were separated from parents until someone talked. But the community held firm, their silence a fortress built from shared complicity. It was old Moses who finally cracked, not from torture but from exhaustion. At 71, after 5 days without proper food, he muttered something in his sleep about the teaching tree. Patterson pounced on this, forcing Moses awake, demanding explanation. "She taught letters," Moses admitted, his 3-fingered hand shaking. under the big oak, said knowing words was knowing power. This revelation sent fresh waves of fear through white Mississippi. A literate slave who could read recipes, calculate dosages, forge documents. Clara wasn't just dangerous, she was systematically trained in her rebellion. Orders went out to check every enslaved person for literacy. Those who could read faced punishment or sale. Ruth watched Moses's confession with carefully hidden calculation. He'd given them something true, but ultimately useless. The teaching tree had been burned the night of the murders. All evidence scattered. Clara had prepared them for this too, knowing someone would eventually break. Give them old truths, she'd said. Things that lead nowhere but sound like somewhere. Meanwhile, the pattern Donovan had discovered was yielding results. If Clara was tracking her daughters, and if the daughters had been sold north, then she was likely following the same route many escaped slaves took, up through Tennessee into Ohio, possibly toward Canada. Telegraph every major city along this route, Donovan ordered. She's got a 3-week head start, but she'll have to stop somewhere. Someone will have seen her. But Clara had anticipated this too. In Cincinnati, she'd already abandoned the Sarah Coleman identity, trading her fine clothes for the rough dress of a laundress. She took work at a boarding house for free blacks, disappearing into a community that knew how to protect its own. Her skin, lightened with lye, was darkening again. Her padded figure slimmed. She became invisible in a different way, just another freed woman trying to survive. Yet survival wasn't her only goal anymore. In quiet moments, she pulled out a carefully guarded piece of paper, a fragment from a letter she'd intercepted years ago. It mentioned 2 young women, formerly enslaved, who'd established a school for black children in Ontario. The names were different, but the ages matched. The letter described one as having her mother's careful hands, and the other as possessing a singing voice that could make angels weep. Clara remembered her daughters' voices, their small hands. Grace always held her left pinky slightly crooked. Patience had a birthmark behind her right ear shaped like a crescent moon. These details lived in her body's memory, carved deeper than any scar. The boarding house where she worked became her new watching place. She had no way of knowing that letter would never arrive, intercepted by authorities who had been watching the mail for exactly such correspondence. The knock came at 4:17 a.m., sharp and deliberate against the boarding house door. Clara woke instantly, her hand finding the vial of poison before her feet found the floor. Through thin walls, she heard boots, multiple pairs, climbing stairs. Freedom always sounds like footsteps in the dark. The boarding house on Elm Street sat in Cincinnati's Bucktown, where free blacks and escaped slaves blended into a community that had learned silence as survival, rain pelting the windows like scattershot. Inside, Clara moved with the efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. She tucked the vial into her bodice, grabbed the small bundle she kept always ready, and slipped toward the back stairs. Mrs. Washington, the boarding house owner, met the authorities at the front door in her nightgown and carefully practiced confusion. Officers? At this hour? What could possibly? We're looking for a woman, Deputy Marshal Franklin interrupted, pushing past her. Goes by Sarah Coleman, among other names. Negro, about 30, small scar on her left hand. Behind them, 3 slave catchers waited with rope and anticipation. The lead tracker, Briggs, had followed handwriting samples from Mississippi to Ohio, comparing every scrap of paper until he'd found her letter at the postal office. Now they had her cornered. Clara reached the back door just as 2 more men rounded the corner. The alley was blocked. Above, she could hear boots thundering through rooms, doors splintering. The other boarders would buy her minutes at most, a community united in strategic ignorance. She retreated to the kitchen where a pot still held last night's dishwater. The window was too small, the cellar a trap. But Clara had survived 11 years of bondage by understanding one truth. Sometimes the only way out is through. "Check every room," Franklin's voice boomed overhead. "She's here somewhere." Clara did something unexpected. She walked straight into the main hallway carrying a wash basin, her head wrapped in a different colored cloth she grabbed from the laundry. When Deputy Franklin nearly collided with her, she gasped and dropped the basin, water splashing across his boots. "Oh, Lord, sir, you frightened me." She affected a different accent, older, more bent. "Just the washerwoman, sir. Come to get the early linens." Franklin studied her face in the dim lamplight. The lye treatment had faded, her natural color returning, but exhaustion and quick thinking had aged her appearance. She kept her scarred hand hidden under the dirty water. "You see any new boarders? Woman about your height?" "No, sir. I keeps to the washing. Don't see much of nobody except dirty clothes." He moved past her, but Briggs stopped. Something in her posture, perhaps, or the way she held perfectly still, prey recognizing predator. "Let me see your hands." The moment stretched like molten glass. Clara lifted her right hand, dripping with soapy water. "This one, sir?" "Both." Upstairs, a door slammed. Someone shouted. The distraction lasted half a second, enough for Clara to fling the remaining water in Briggs's face and bolt for the front door. She burst onto Elm Street as dawn cracked the sky like an egg, spilling pale yellow light across wet cobblestones. "That's her," Briggs roared, wiping his eyes. "That's the poisoner." Clara ran with the speed of desperation, but Cincinnati streets weren't Mississippi swamps. No hidden paths, no familiar darkness. Behind her, boots and shouts multiplied. Ahead, the city was waking. Delivery wagons, dock workers, a world of potential witnesses. She turned down an alley, leaped a fence, crashed through a backyard where chickens exploded in panicked feathers. The Ohio River appeared between buildings, wide and indifferent, the border between slave states and theoretical freedom. But crossing required ferry tickets, documentation, things she no longer had. The chase funneled toward the waterfront where morning fog rolled off the river like spirits escaping. Clara's breathing came in burning gasps. The vial bounced against her ribs with each stride. One swallow, and this would end on her terms. But something stronger than fear drove her forward, the possibility that her daughters were only miles away across that water, living lives she'd killed to give them. She reached the docks as full sunlight broke through. Steamboats lined up like slumbering giants. Dock workers paused their loading to stare at the spectacle. A black woman in house clothes, pursued by armed men. Some stepped aside, others didn't move fast enough, sending Clara careening through coils of rope and stacked crates. "Stop her," Franklin commanded. $500 to the man who brings her down." That changed the mathematics. Dock workers who might have looked away now saw opportunity. Clara found herself herded toward the pier's end where the Ohio River lapped against rotting wood. The water was high from September rains, brown with upstream soil, moving fast enough to carry bodies to the Mississippi. She turned to face her pursuers. 7 men formed a semicircle, cutting off escape. Briggs stepped forward, rope ready. "It's over, Clara, or should I say Adney?" Hearing her true name spoken by these men felt like violation. Clara's hand found the vial. "You know nothing of who I am." "We know you murdered 12 people," Franklin said. "Poisoned them at their own table. Women, children." "Children?" Clara laughed, bitter as arsenic. "You want to speak of children? Where were your laws when my babies were sold? Where was your justice when I begged to say goodbye? That doesn't give you the right." "Right?" Clara's voice rose above the river sounds. "You speak of rights? You who buy and sell human beings like cattle? You who separate mothers from daughters, wives from husbands? You who work us until we break and then sell the pieces?" Behind the men, a crowd had gathered. Free blacks, Irish dock workers, even some well-dressed whites drawn by commotion. They watched this woman standing at the edge of everything, speaking truths usually swallowed. "Whatever wrongs were done," Franklin said, trying to regain control. "The law demands your law." Clara pulled out the vial, holding it high where everyone could see. "Your law says I'm property, says my daughters were property, says our lives matter less than your comfort. I reject your law." She uncorked the vial. Several men stepped forward but stopped when she held it to her lips. "I've spent 11 years serving poison disguised as food. Today I choose my own feast." "Wait!" Dr. Webb pushed through the crowd, having arrived on the morning train. He'd studied her journal, her methods, her mind. "Your daughters. Don't you want to know what happened to them?" Clara hesitated. The vial trembled in her hand. Webb continued quickly. "I traced them, after the Beauregards, after the Lancasters. They were sold, yes, but not separated. A Quaker family bought them both, took them to Canada. They're teachers now, just like you suspected. Free women, educated, alive." "You're lying," but her voice cracked with dangerous hope. "Grace has your hands," Webb said, remembering the journal's descriptions. "Patience sings in the church choir. They use the names you gave them, not the ones their owners imposed. They're free, Clara. They're free because you survived long enough to give them that chance." The crowd held its breath. The river lapped. The sun climbed higher, burning off the fog. Clara stood between water and land. Death and capture, the past and a future she'd never see. "If I drink this," she said finally, "I die a free woman. If I surrender, I die a slave. Either way, I die, but only one way dies on my terms." She looked across the water toward Canada, toward daughters who might remember her face, her voice, her hands teaching them to hide their intelligence until it could bloom in safer soil. Then she looked at the men who'd hunted her, at the crowd bearing witness, at the city where she'd almost disappeared completely. "Tell them," she said to Webb, to everyone, to history itself. "Tell them their mother loved them enough to become a monster. Tell them their mother chose her own ending." Time slowed. The vial rose. Men lunged forward. The crowd surged. And in that chaos of movement and shouting, Clara made her final choice. Not the poison, not surrender, but the river itself. She turned and leaped. The brown water swallowed her like the earth swallowing secrets. They searched for hours, days. The river gave up nothing. 3 bodies washed ashore that September. 2 white men who drowned in separate incidents, and an elderly black woman from upriver. None were Clara. The Ohio kept its secrets like a mother protecting her child. Brown waters rolling toward the Mississippi with stubborn silence. Some say drowning is the worst death. But those who've never been owned don't understand that drowning happens in kitchens too. Sheriff Donovan stood on the Cincinnati docks at sunset October 1st, watching search boats drag nets through crimson-reflected water. The sound of chains pulling through mud echoed across the riverfront, metal scraping against whatever lay beneath. Local fishermen claimed the current could carry a body 20 miles in a day, could wedge it under fallen trees, or bury it in silt banks that shifted like living things. "We need a body," Donovan told the search crew for the 100th time. "No body, no proof. No proof, no justice." But what kind of justice chases a woman across 3 states for avenging her stolen children? The question hung unasked in the evening air, heavy as humidity. Dr. Webb had remained in Cincinnati, ostensibly to identify Clara if found, but his motivations had grown complex. He'd spent weeks studying her journal, her methods, her mind. The woman who emerged from those pages wasn't the monster Southern newspapers described. She was an architect of careful revenge, a mother hollowed out by loss, a chemist who'd turned kitchen knowledge into warfare. He visited the boarding house where she'd stayed, interviewing residents who suddenly remembered nothing. Mrs. Washington insisted she'd never harbored runways, didn't know any Sarah Coleman, certainly had never seen anyone matching Clara's description. Her denials came with the practiced smoothness of someone who'd lied to protect lives before. But Webb noticed things. A loose floorboard in the room Clara had rented, underneath which lay a hidden compartment containing $37 and a train schedule for Canada. A half-finished letter in that distinctive handwriting. "My dearest daughters, if you remember your mother at all." She'd been planning to reach them. The river had stolen that reunion. Or had it? On October 7th, a peculiar incident occurred 40 miles downstream. A farmer named Thompson reported his skiff missing along with fresh clothes from his wife's washing line. His wife mentioned seeing a figure near the river at dawn, too distant to identify clearly, moving with the careful steps of someone favoring their left side. Could have been anyone, the local sheriff dismissed. Plenty of vagrants along the river. But Webb had read Clara's journal entry about dislocating her left shoulder as a child, how it still ached in cold weather. He kept this detail to himself, filing it away with other uncertainties. Back in Mississippi, the Whitmore plantation had been sold at auction. The 47 enslaved people were scattered to different buyers, their carefully maintained silence broken apart by distance. Ruth ended up at a plantation near Jackson, where she continued teaching letters in secret using Clara's methods. Old Moses died that winter, taking his memories to ground softer than any he'd worked. The poisoning had changed everything and nothing. Kitchens across the South became sites of suspicion. Some plantations instituted new rules. Slaves couldn't handle food alone, couldn't purchase supplies, couldn't possess anything that might contain poison. But rules couldn't eliminate the fear that had taken root, the knowledge that the supposedly powerless had power, that every meal could be a weapon. Patterson, the cruel overseer, lasted 2 months at his next position before dying of what appeared to be dysentery. The symptoms were consistent with natural disease, but the enslaved community's lack of surprise suggested otherwise. Clara had taught more than letters under that oak tree. In Cincinnati, autumn turned the riverbanks golden russet. The search had been called off. Clara officially declared dead by drowning. But stories began circulating in Bucktown, whispered in churches and markets. A woman seen at dawn gathering herbs by the river, a familiar face glimpsed on a northbound train, money left anonymously for families hiding runaways, always in amounts of $37. Dr. Webb interviewed Grace and patients in Ontario that November, traveling at his own expense. The young women, 19 and 21, now ran a school for black children in a small farming community. They'd taken the surnames Freeman, leaving their enslaved past behind except in the careful way they held themselves, the watchfulness that never fully faded. "We heard about the poisonings," Grace said, her hands so like Clara's folded precisely in her lap. "They say our mother did it." "What do you remember of her?" Webb asked. Patience spoke softly. Hands that could be gentle with cornbread and cruel with necessity. A voice that sang us to sleep with songs from her mother's mother, eyes that went somewhere else when the master called her away. "She taught us to read using flour on the kitchen table," Grace added. "Said knowledge was the only thing they couldn't sell." Webb showed them Clara's journal, certain pages. They read their mother's words with faces carved from stone, giving away nothing. But that night, neighbors reported hearing singing from their house. Old songs in a language that predated their enslavement, melodies that sounded like mourning and celebration entwined. The truth began forming like fog over water. Clara had poisoned 12 people across 5 years, possibly more. She'd traced her daughters through careful intelligence gathering. She'd built a network of forged documents and hidden knowledge. And then she'd vanished into the Ohio River at the exact moment when capture seemed certain. Bodies sink in muddy water, but sometimes they also swim. By December, reported sightings came from as far as Detroit, Chicago, even Boston. A woman matching Clara's description, working in a hotel kitchen, a letter in that distinctive handwriting received by abolitionists. Money sent to families of the enslaved, always exact amounts. $37, $12, $5 for the year she'd planned. Sheriff Donovan filed his final report on December 22, 1847. Clara, Negro woman, cook, deceased by drowning while fleeing arrest for murder. Case closed. Justice served. But Webb kept investigating, driven by professional curiosity that had transformed into something else. He found patterns in the sightings, a northward progression always near water. He traced poison purchases in towns along the route, small amounts, medicinal doses. Nothing suspicious unless you knew what to look for. On Christmas Eve, he received an unmarked letter at his hotel. Inside, a single pressed magnolia blossom, the kind that didn't grow this far north, the kind someone would have to carry from Mississippi. No words, no signature. Just that flower, still faintly scented, speaking volumes in the language of the deliberately alive. Webb burned the letter and the flower that night, watching evidence curl into smoke. Some truths, he decided, were better drowned than documented. He returned to Mississippi after New Year's, resuming his practice, never speaking publicly about Clara again. But he kept her journal hidden in his medical bag. Sometimes late at night he'd read her entries about poison preparation and think about the thin line between medicine and murder, healing and harming, how the same hands that comforted could kill, how the same knowledge that saved could destroy. The river rolled on, carrying its secrets toward the sea. And somewhere in Ontario, in Chicago, in the spaces between history and legend, a woman who might or might not be Clara continued her journey, free, alive, unrepentant. The Ohio River never gave up her body. But then, rivers know how to keep the stories that matter most. 20 years later, in a Chicago boarding house kitchen, an elderly black woman trained new cooks with particular attention to seasoning. "Remember," she'd say, stirring soup with practiced grace, "the secret ingredient is always intention." Her name was Martha Washington. Common enough to be forgettable, old enough to be invisible. Scarred hand always gloved in proper Victorian fashion. The boarding house on State Street served mainly black travelers and European immigrants, people who knew about running toward new lives. The kitchen smelled of onions and hope in equal measure. While outside, the city rebuilt itself after the Great Fire, rising from ashes like a story refusing to die. In the evening light, when shadows grew long as memory, Martha would pause in her stirring and stare at nothing, seeing daughters she'd found and lost again. Grace and Patience Freeman had visited once in the spring of 1868. They'd stood in the boarding house parlor like beautiful strangers, educated and elegant, calling her Mrs. Washington with voices that carefully didn't tremble. The reunion lasted 2 hours, long enough to say everything, too short to heal anything. They spoke of their school, their students, their lives built on the foundation of her absence. "We understand why," Grace had said, her careful hands, so like Clara's, folded in her lap. "But understanding and forgiving are different rivers." They never came back. But they sent letters, formal and distant, signed "Your Daughters in Freedom." Martha kept them in the same hidden compartment where she stored $37 and a vial she no longer needed. The boarding house became known for more than good food. Runaways found their way there. Even after the war ended and legal slavery died, Martha taught them what she'd learned, how to change their walk, their voice, their entire presence, how to forge documents with confidence, how to read the danger in white folks' eyes before it reached their hands, how to survive. She never spoke of Mississippi, but Mississippi spoke through her, in the way she tested every dish before serving, in the locked cabinet where she kept spices and other substances, in the nightmares that made her wake screaming names no one recognized: Emma, Cornelius, Margaret, 12 voices calling from her dreams. Young Sarah, who helped in the kitchen once, asked about the scars on Martha's hands, not just the burn mark that gave away her identity, but dozens of tiny cuts as if she'd spent years gripping broken glass. "Every scar tells a story," Martha replied. Some stories are better left untold, but stories, like rivers, find their own paths. Dr. Webb died in 1871, his medical practice successful, his reputation intact. Among his papers, his son found a journal and a letter marked, "To be opened only upon my death." The letter contained a confession. He'd falsified his final report on Clara. The body of an elderly black woman found downstream had been officially identified as the poisoner, allowing the case to close. But Webb had known the corpse's hands bore no scars, the age was wrong, the entire identification a carefully constructed lie. "Some justice," he wrote, "exists outside the law. Clara was guilty of murder, but the system that created her was guilty of worse. I chose to let the river keep its secrets." His son burned both letter and journal, but not before reading Clara's recipes, not for poison, but for survival. How to stretch hope thin enough to last 11 years, how to love children you might never see again, how to turn rage into patience, patience into planning, planning into action. Back in Chicago, Martha Washington aged into her 70s. Her movements slower, but her mind sharp as the knives she taught young cooks to wield. The boarding house thrived, becoming a cornerstone of the black community, a place where stories were shared and secrets kept. One winter evening in 1882, a young woman arrived seeking work. She had careful hands and watchful eyes, introduced herself as Clara Freeman. Martha's breath caught, but she showed nothing. "My mother named me for someone she admired," the young woman explained, "someone who chose freedom over safety." This Clara was Patience's daughter, carrying her grandmother's name into a new generation. She'd come to Chicago to study medicine, not officially since no school would accept her, but through apprenticeships and borrowed books and sheer determination. Martha taught her everything. Cooking, certainly, but also chemistry disguised as recipes, how certain herbs could heal or harm depending on dosage, how to read people's intentions in their appetites, how to hide knowledge behind humility. The granddaughter she'd never thought to meet became her most devoted student. "Why teach me this?" Clara the younger asked one night after learning about substances that could stop a heart or save it. "Because knowledge is power," Martha replied, echoing words she'd spoken under an oak tree decades ago. "And power in the right hands can change the world." The old woman died in 1885, peacefully in her sleep, or so the death certificate claimed. But Clara Freeman found evidence of a final dose, self-administered, timed perfectly. Even her death was a choice, not a surrender. At the funeral, an unexpected mourner appeared, an elderly white woman from Mississippi, expensively dressed, face hidden by a black veil. She left a single magnolia blossom on the coffin and departed without speaking. Later investigation revealed she was Emma Whitmore, the youngest grandchild who'd complained about the funny taste, who died first at that poisoned supper. Except she hadn't died. Clara had given the children a different dose, something to mimic death, not cause it. The adults had received the full measure of her revenge, but the children she'd spared, understanding their innocence in a way the world had never recognized hers. Emma had been smuggled out in a coffin, raised by abolitionists, living her entire life knowing she owed it to the woman who'd killed her family and saved her life. The boarding house continued operating until the turn of the century, run by Clara Freeman and others who'd learned Martha Washington's recipes. They served good food and better lessons, creating a legacy seasoned with memory and intention. But even now, some say on humid nights when the Chicago wind carries the wrong memories, you can smell something burning in kitchens where nothing's on the stove. Magnolia and metal, arsenic and absolution. The scent of choices made in darkness, served at tables where everyone pretends not to know what they're really tasting. They found Clara's journal in the boarding house walls during demolition in 1923. The final entry, dated the night before she jumped into the Ohio River, contained no recipes, no plans, no confessions, Just 4 words in that distinctive handwriting. My daughters are free. Some chains break only when you're willing to become the monster they already think you are. Clara knew this, taught this, died and lived by this. And somewhere in Chicago, in Ontario, in every kitchen where hands prepare food with careful intention, her story continues. Not in books or courts or official records, but in the space between seasoning and serving, where love and rage combine to create flavors that linger long after the meal is done. The poison was never just in the food. It was in the system that made the food necessary. Even today, in certain southern towns, they whisper about the Whitmore plantation murders, how 12 people died at a birthday dinner, how the cook vanished like smoke, how justice was never served or perhaps was served too well on silver platters with a garnish of long-delayed vengeance.